Here we go. Welcome, welcome everybody. Glad to have you back this morning. We'll give folks another minute to get settled, to join us, to log in, figure out their audios. Please share your faces if you're not feeling shy, if you did get up and get dressed today. And some of you might be enjoying this in your pajamas, or it might be a different time of day. So I certainly understand, but we love to see faces. So thank you, Mary and Jessica, for checking in. We just have one more minute and then we'll get started, and I will introduce to you your host for this morning. If you would, do keep yourselves on mute so we can distract from outside noises, but we do want to see your faces and we do want to hear from you, and we will be engaging you in the chat. So please make sure you know where that is so you can answer questions. Alrighty, it is 10 a.m. so we will get started. My name is Kirsten Sancurico, and I am a farmer, a gardener, a mother, a volunteer. I work for the New York Alliance as well as the Learning Community for Person-Centered Practices, and I live in Schoharie, New York. And I'm excited to introduce to you my new friend, who I can tell I have a lot in common with already because she is also from New York and very close by my home. And her name is Cheryl Ryan Chan, and she's here to talk about They Said He's Too Dangerous. I just love that title. I think it's so catchy. So welcome everybody. Thank you, Cheryl. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm delighted that you're here, and it is truly an incredible honor to be here. And I'll tell you why. The people that are attending today and some of the sponsors that are attending today are among my mentors, the people that are just most important to me in my life and have influenced me for so long. So it's truly an honor. And I'm a frequent public speaker, but today I've got some nerves, I'll tell you. But this is going to be great. I'm really excited about this particular presentation and excited to tell you a story. I think the format that I'm going to use today is I'll keep it open to questions. They're going to be monitoring Kristen is going to be monitoring the chat room for me, because it's really hard for me to do both of those things. So every once in a while, as I said to Kristen, I pick up my water bottle and wet my whistle, and so that I can go on. And that's usually my cue to see if there are any questions. So feel free to go ahead and put your questions in chat or raise your hand or whatever. And when it's time for me to take a quick question break, I will give you that cue and we'll keep this conversation going. So that's part of how we're going to do this today. But my plan in the next hour is to tell a story that is truly, I think, inspiring. Why is it inspiring? It's because it's about my son, Nicky, who frankly doesn't fall into the mold of what we think of as a person who might be successful in traditional shared living. But he overcame all of that. And you're going to find out more about that as we go along. But while I'm sharing, I'm going to share this story and it's going to be inspiring. Then I'm going to talk about the elements of success to Nicky's story. But by the time we're done, you may end up finding yourself a little bit frustrated as well. And that's okay, because frankly, that's part of my plan today too. I want to plant some of the seeds of thought around changes in our thinking about the way we are approaching shared living as systems providers and as consumers. And I want to also bring some heightened awareness of some of the challenges that we face in this global culture that, by and large, devalues citizens who live outside of the societal norms of our individual cultures. So that's my hope and plan and vision for today. And let's get started. Now, as Kristen said, I do person-centered planning. I'm a person-centered practitioner at heart. And I've learned all of those core values from, again, many of the people who are joining us today. So I practice those in everything that I do. And so I'm going to start off by talking about Nicky and introducing him in a way that isn't very person-centered. But I need to do that to kind of illustrate where we're at. And it is important to this story. So my son, Nicky, I'm not going to go into his whole birth story and all of that. My son, Nicky, is going to be 30 years old in just a couple of weeks. And he is now living here in central Massachusetts, nearby where I am, about 45 minutes away. But prior to 2007, Nicky when he was about 13, 14 years old, Nicky was in a traditional public school system. He wasn't mainstreamed or anything like that. He was in a substantially separate, isolated setting, sometimes in a closet. And, they were doing the best that they could. Nicky has what is termed severe autism. And his severe autism manifests itself in a couple of ways. One with profound intellectual disabilities, and the other with severe, violent, dangerous behavioral challenges. There's no other way really to describe it. That's why Nicky hasn't been able to live in our family home since he was about 13 years old. And that's okay. It's part of Nicky's journey. From 2007 to 2012, Nicky was admitted to a psychiatric, in 2007, Nicky was admitted to a psychiatric hospital with a developmental disabilities unit in New Hampshire. When that happened, despite everyone's best efforts in Nicky's circle of support, including my husband and myself, of course, we were no longer able to keep him safe at home or be safe with him at home. So he went to a psychiatric hospital, and we basically said he can't come home. We need to find him residential placement straight from here. It took 9 months and multiple rejections before Nicky was admitted to a hospital-based lockdown residential unit near Boston, Massachusetts, where he stayed for 5 years, cornered and held behind a desk with padded walls all day long, escorted by 2, sometimes 3 people at all times. And for much of the time that he was there, he was not even allowed outdoors. He had full prone restraints at the rate of 8 to 10 per day for non-compliance and self-injury. Frankly, that number was probably quite a bit higher. So that is the life that Nicky led from 2007 to 2012. It was about 2012 when Nicky was approaching the age of 20, which is when typically, wherever we are, we start talking about the adult service world, the next step, the next place for our loved ones to go. And so the topic of transition started coming up. And I was talking at the time with the folks who were running this lockdown residential unit in Massachusetts. What was going on, though, at that time was, with all of the things that I've described, the cornering, all of the inhumane treatment that Nicky was getting, the narrative at the time under the heading of transition became more of, this guy is going to need to be in a place where he is handled, managed, controlled, and restrained. He's too scary. He's too dangerous. It's hopeless. He will never be able to integrate in the community because he can't be safe around other people, and on and on and on. This was the prevailing message from the institution that had him for 5 years. And frankly, to be honest, the 5 years that we had endured as a family and the years before he left our home had me and my husband, all of us, nearly convinced that all of these things were true, that he was too dangerous, that he couldn't ever integrate, that he could never be a part of a community. We were beaten down and at the mercy of this institution, and we were given little hope that there could be any other possibility. This was the mindset that we were in. Now, as his mom, was thinking at that time about my vision for Nicky's future life, of course, I wanted to hold on to possibility. I wanted to hold on to the idea that maybe even if he were in a group home, he would be able to have a kind of joyful life that, I wasn't able to provide for him in our family home, but I still had those hopes and dreams that could happen. I didn't feel like I could express those because, again, the prevailing message, the prevailing thought, the data, all of the behaviors, the way Nicky was in that moment was saying just the opposite, that he would never be able to succeed. So I was battling with that internally. And in the meantime, the systems, the providers, the institution were moving forward with this other narrative that just was hopeless. Then I had a life-changing meeting. Now, I happened to check out who was attending this workshop today. And I'm going to tell you a story about this life-changing meeting that involves one of the attendees that's here right now. And he knows who he is. His name is George. And I tell this story with a little bit of humor, but I need you to understand that this really, truly was a life-changing moment for me. This was right around 2012 when we were looking at moving Nicky into his adult situation and all of this narrative was taking place. I was called into a meeting where I was working in development for a systems provider at the time. And this meeting was being attended by multiple leaders of provider agencies, as well as leaders from a local church community who were interested in hearing more about shared living and how they, as a church community, could support the community of people with disabilities. So it was a really neat meeting, and I was called in with my hat on as anyone in development or anyone with the agency, but as a mom to Nicky. I was asked to tell the story of Nicky. And so I started telling the story, and I was very forward and direct. And I told them about all of the challenges that Nicky had. And I told them that we were approaching Nicky's adulthood. And I said that I made the statement that Nicky has so many challenges that he will never be able to live in any situation other than a group home with significant support surrounding him. Now, the way I tell the story is that in that moment, this man across from me, who happened to be George Fleischner, the president of Nonotuck Resource Associates, and now one of my dearest friends, stood up and leaned over the table and got right into my face and said, "How dare you say something like that about your son? Why would you dismiss the possibility of him being successful anywhere else except for a group home?" Now, the truth is, George did not stand up and lean over the table and get into my face. The truth, but that's exactly what he said, almost word for word. Now, for me, I'm going, wait a minute. First of all, how dare you speak to me like that, Mr. Whoever you are? And second, it was like somebody had just opened up a curtain of possibility that I had again, been holding back and not wanting to talk about. But boy, was that a life-changing moment. Again, George, if you knew him, and if he decides to pop in and wave, you'll know immediately that that's not the kind of guy that's going to go yelling or screaming. However, it was that dramatic for me. It really was. So make no mistake that this will ever play out in my head, and just like that, as one of the most momentous and memorable times of my life. George's words truly opened my eyes, and I went on a journey of self-reflection in that moment about myself and how I was stewarding the humanity of my son. Now, I plan to get back to Nicky's story in a little while, and I want you to hang on with me because it's gonna blow your mind what I'm gonna tell you happened as Nicky's journey continued to unfold. But I really wanted to make sure that I took my opportunity and my microphone today to talk about some reflections that I have about in a more global sense. You know, the key takeaways and the lessons for this particular story are global. They go beyond. They're not just about one person's story. And I think that some of the key takeaways really are about some of those seeds that I said that I wanted to plant today, seeds of change, of thought, and where we are. There are so many disconnections in how things are done and how things are operated, that I really want to bring forward some of those because I think they have some strong impact for all of you. And I think we need to take a moment to talk about these things together. Now, I want to start with how shared living is defined. The definitions on the left are ones that I found under the United States Department of Labor, and one unnamed state. It is not New York and is not Massachusetts, but it is on the East Coast. Let me tell you how shared living is defined by the US Department of Labor. These are programs often funded by Medicaid or other public sources, called by different names such as adult foster care, paid roommate arrangements, or host homes, in which an individual receiving services and a direct care worker providing the services live together. End, period. Another definition that I found in my research before I started today was from this East Coast state. Shared living means an arrangement in which the state's program of medical assistance pays a portion of the person's rent, utilities, and food expenses in return for the person's residing with and providing companionship, support, and other limited basic assistance to a person with intellectual or developmental disabilities receiving medical assistance services in accordance with a waiver for whom he has no legal responsibility. Then I went ahead and did some research on a couple of other shared living definitions. One I found within Nonotuck Resource Associates, which is the Massachusetts-based provider that takes care of my son, Nicky. And here's how they define shared living. It's a service that brings together an individual, a couple, or a family in the community with a person who has a disability to share their lives in an authentic, loving, and respectful relationship of mutual dependence. Shared living is successful when there is mutuality of love and respect, a person and caregiver on equal footing. Each have responsibilities and they can both depend on each other. This is where each person has the space to live their most genuine lives, with opportunity, choice, and a voice. I did another search and found this from the National Association of Directors of Developmental Disability Services, their Shared Living Guide, published back in 2011. The term shared living invites people to have an experience rather than to work at a job or provide a service. And share means just that, not allow, permit, provide, but as the thesaurus offers, to communicate, disclose, and let somebody in on. This concept of sharing presupposes a mutual experience, not a hierarchical one. Shared living presupposes mutual respect. It's also about shifting the balance of power, and done right with a strong focus on the individual. Shared living can alter, indeed eliminate, the power relationship. In true shared living, both the individual with a disability and the person with him, living with him or her, gain mutual benefit, living as equals in the same household. So I want you to take a moment with me to reflect on the contrast here. The definitions on the left talk about the technical aspects of shared living, how the model is financed, and it perpetuates the idea of hierarchies in shared living. There's a dependent and there's someone in charge. These definitions even place limitations on interactions, clearly creating the idea that this is simply a transactional relationship. The definitions on the right speak of dignity. They speak of relationships, friendships, and love. Think about this, how this comes across to families seeking a joyful, dignified life for the one that they love. Which definition would draw you more when faced with decision-making about your loved one? So my introduction to shared living was the definition on the left, because I was in that place where I was starting to educate myself about options. And so I had learned about shared living through the definitions by the systems that were operating housing models. But George, following that dramatic meeting, opened my eyes to something else. And Nonotuck Resource Associates was the first provider that I really started learning that different set of core values and beliefs around shared living. So it was really, really confusing, I have to tell you. And I think that confusion is part of the problem that we have as a global community, because the definitions of shared living are inconsistent, and families hear first the systems definition that speaks only of the technical terminology for how it's set up. And because the systems have appropriated shared living as simply a housing option, not a way of living and sharing joy, and because we are still living in the institutional mindset that it's least expensive and most efficient to use congregate housing models and fill beds, families are not choosing shared living because they believe that their loved ones are safer when there are more staff around. Shared living makes them more vulnerable to abuse or neglect. They believe the model decreases opportunities for peer interactions and activities and increases isolation. They hear stories of people having to move every year or even more frequently because providers quit. They are afraid that their loved one will bond with caregivers and become less bonded with them. And they aren't provided the explanation of benefits of building authentic relationships that will sustain beyond them, the family unit. So there's a lot of confusion around the different kinds of definitions that we see of shared living. And so that might lead some people to think, well, maybe we just need to do a better job of educating families. Maybe we need to do a marketing campaign and educate consumers. But I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that gets to the core heart of the issues and the problems around our global thinking of shared living. I think that these are based on truths. These beliefs that families have are based on truths about shared living because most of the time it is simply not done well. It's simply not supported. Providers are adding it to their service menus, but they don't know actually how to do it. They don't know how to be supportive. And they certainly are not using the vernacular of love, mutual dependence, respect, and relationships. So before we demystify for families and simply try to re-educate them, the systems of support, they need to figure this out for themselves. Now, I'm going to go on with a little more points I want to make about the confusion. Families find all of this very confusing, because we have been conditioned to believe that our loved ones are unable to live full lives because they need more support than shared living can provide. Boy, that was the prominent message that I received about Nicky. There's no way that he could ever be supported in shared living. We've also been conditioned to believe that communication about care should be within predetermined guidelines, limited to the hierarchy of leadership created by the provider, that there should never be direct communication, never mind relationships with direct care staff. The more direct care staff there are, the better. And we've also been conditioned to believe that, like that first point, only the best behaved, verbally skilled, high functioning participants can be successful in shared living. So all of these things, all of these beliefs are happening. And again, I would present to you that that's not, and that is nowhere near any sort of marketing issue or educational issue. These are really real fears, because these are some of the things that are happening in shared living situations that are not led first with the core values that true shared living should be based on, which are, again, meaningful relationships. Now, I certainly don't have all the answers to what needs to change and how we need to do it, okay? But I do believe that a shift in thinking and in practice of the magnitude that needs to take place and true change is going to take years and years. Indeed, I believe that this is probably not going to happen until the current generation of young adults reaches the leadership positions necessary to make change happen. And let me tell you why. There are many exceptions of current leaders who understand and do their very best to bring in those core values of relationships. But the younger folks in the generation before mine learned side by side with their disabled peers in school. And vis-a-vis that, they are far more enlightened through their lived experiences about capacity and possibility. You know, sometimes to illustrate that, I think about an experience I had years ago when Nicky was a young adult, and he came in to Walmart twice with me and his support people to do some shopping, twice in a week. And the first time that he went in, the woman behind the counter at the checkout line was an older woman, older than myself. And she started scanning, and, you know, Nicky was making his noises because he was really excited, and he had his helmet on, and, you know, he was jumping up and down, and he's, you know, 5 feet 9, 10 inches tall. And this woman got very, very nervous, and she wouldn't make any eye contact, and she just kind of did her work as fast as she could to get us through the line. And later on in that week, we went back to Walmart, and this time there was a young woman who was much younger than me, one of Nicky's peers, his age, who was in line, and she was doing the checkout counter. And Nicky, it was the same Nicky, and he was standing there, and she looked over at him and she goes, "Hey buddy, how you doing? I hope you're having a good day. I had someone just like you in my classroom when I was growing up, and he was really cool." And when we were done, she said, "Thank you." She gave Nicky the change. She gave him a high five, and off we went. And so I often think about those two very different experiences. And that kind of is what leads me to believe and have hope in the next generation of leaders, that they will bring those lived experiences and be able to do a better job of understanding and realizing that relationships can happen, that they can look very different, but they can be authentic, and that they can really be built upon, and that anyone with different abilities has the capacity to be valued and to be a friend. But right now, the capacities and possibilities that are recognized and supported by the education system at varying levels of success, as we all know, those end on the day that the person leaves the educational system and enters the world of adult services, where usually it's get in line, pick one of these 2 or 3 choices, and we'll try to shove that person into the square hole as, as best we can. And if that doesn't work, we'll build a behavior plan until he does like what he's doing. And be grateful and don't rock the boat. It's not about who the person is. It's not about their gifts, their dreams and wishes, who their natural supports are, how they can be a part of the team, and on, except when the values and tenets of life sharing and shared living, as taught by thought leaders like Jean Vanier, founder of the L'Arche movement, and thought leaders like John and Connie O'Brien, Beth Mount, Peter Block, John McKnight, Jack Pearpoint, Linda Kahn, a lot of the people who are at inclusion.com, one of the sponsors of today's conference, but also among my most valued mentors. Providers who embrace those values and build shared living services around them have profound impacts on lives, and yet they are still few and far between. Nicky's story still is one of inspiration, but also very rare. And they are still undervalued and overlooked, because in our system-centered world, you can't put a price point on happiness and dignity. So here are some of the thoughts that I have to add to the think tank that exists around how we can change things. First, valuation of relationships and creating spaces where relationships can be fostered and strengthened need to be held to a standard. Our need and reliance on relationships is what makes us human, period. It's just a fact. And when that part of our existence is dismissed, we suffer a loss of our humanity. Relationships and institutional living models are non-existent. Indeed, the opposite is cultivated. Direct care workers are discouraged from building relationships because they get in the way of care. How ironic. When you think about it, any of us who have experience with institutionalized settings, the group home world, and so on and so forth, you never get to, there's never a space and a place or time devoted to, or value devoted to, building relationships. Direct care workers are there to make sure that the human people that they're supporting stay alive, are relatively safe and fed. And it tends to end there. Versus shared living, when done well by providers who hold up the definitions that include life sharing, mutual dependence, and love, come closer to the kinds of longevity and sustainable situations than anyone else does. So we must make that one of our core tenets of change. In addition, presumptions of capacity first and the removal of dependence as a reward also must become part of the way that we do things. Because capacity lies in possibility, not just in what a person can do in this moment, but what they could be capable of with appropriate supports and providers who embrace lifelong learning and opportunity rather than keeping people fed and housed. Right now, services are divvied up according to who needs them the most. And if you're an industry person and not a family member, here's a little secret. We have created a golden rule among families. When the systems come to visit and evaluate need, don't tell them about the good stuff. Tell them the worst stories you've got, because that will get you more. And that is where the seeds of distrust between families and service providers, that's where those are planted. And that's the seeds of distrust are planted the moment services begin. So again, that's one of the core, those are some of the core tenets of change that I believe are necessary. I also believe it's going to take a lot of time And I also believe, frankly, that, I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of people out there. I have a lot of people in my life whose loved ones are in group homes, and they are adamant that the group home setting is better for their individual. And that's fine. We all have our own journey. I believe in something very different, but I also believe that these core tenets, these values in the shared living environment could absolutely be applied to any other housing model, because relationships and love are universal. It's where the systems devalue those things as things that are necessary to success and simply operate to fill the beds and get those numbers in there and get the bad numbers down and the good numbers up and so on and so forth. That's where we're losing all of these things. But they are really by virtue of just the shared living approach, when done well, a lot of these are absent because relationships do build. My son, Nicky, has had 2 shared living providers in 10 years, 2 people who have lived with him. That is extraordinary. Both of them have had and currently have a loving, wonderful relationship with my son. I have always had their personal cell phone numbers. My husband and I go over and visit Nicky at his house, and we hang out with the whole gang over there. We have a family relationship we have built because there have been no barriers, no frowning upon any of that in this shared living, mutually dependent, loving situation. We have built a family, an extended family, one that is based on trust and mutual respect, among other things. And again, I will be showing you, let's get back to Nicky's story a little bit, because I want to illustrate even more the possibility with Nicky's story. Actually, what I'll do is I'll stop, pause, take a little sip. Oh, goodness, there's a lot going on in the chat. So before we get back to our story, I need to wet my whistle. Kristen, are there any questions that I could field right now?
So there aren't any questions, just a lot of people checking in from where they're from, but also a lot of encouragement that what you're saying is just so powerful and meaningful. So somebody said, bingo. And so right on every point, such a clear call for changes. Someone told you to keep preaching it.
I
So
will.
I think you have a lot of fans in today's session.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So great. So I'll just move forward and be buoyed by these pronouncements. Thank you so much to all of you. So let's get back to Nicky's story. So I've had this profound moment at a meeting with George, and my mind is swirling with ideas and excitement mixed with some major fears that this cannot and will not work. There were some major needs that had to be met before we could even really begin focusing on the vision. And I want to share with you what those needs were, because they were big ones. First of all, we needed to find a provider agency willing and ready to take on a challenging individual in a shared living setting. Fortunately for us, we already had Nonotuck Resource Associates as that change agent, that provider and that agent that we wanted to have in place, because I had met George. So check box on that. But if that hadn't happened, we really needed to do our shopping and be very careful about it. We needed to find a shared living caregiver willing to take on the challenges. Now, for us, as I've illustrated by talking candidly about Nicky's behaviors and his challenges, this was going to be a big one. And this probably was going to be the one that was going to be the most difficult of our core needs. We needed to find somebody who was willing to take Nicky on as he was in that moment, which I already illustrated was multiple dangerous behaviors throughout the day. So that was a tall order. Nonotuck Resource Associates was willing to take that on. And in fact, they found, and they continue to find, the providers and the workers who work with Nicky. They did a lot of research. They learned about him, but they held on to their own beliefs that there was capacity there and possibility there. So they were able to find somebody. Now, in addition to that, they also had recognized immediately that they needed to spend a lot more time and a lot more planning and a lot more resources to surround this shared living caregiver with the supports that he needed to make sure that he felt like he was properly supported, that he had backup, that he had a plan, a solid plan of how to address, that he had all of these things, that he had the training that he felt he needed and that Nonotuck wanted to provide him. This had to be very well thought out. So we needed that in place in addition. And then finally, this is one of the components that isn't always going to have to be the case, but for us it was. So I want to share a little bit of detail about it. The family owns the house and the caregiver will have to move and rent from the family. We set this up for a specific reason. We purchased a home for Nicky, a small house in a small town in Massachusetts. And we purchased that because we knew a couple of things. One, that when Nicky, so first of all, Nicky needed to be in a place where it was certain that he wouldn't have to be moving very quickly. It may have been likely, we had to think about the possibility that, it may be a couple of shared living caregivers it may take a couple of times to find one that would be able to live well with Nicky. And we knew that kind of nomadic lifestyle wasn't going to be good for Nicky, that he would not transition well and adapt well with that going on. So we wanted to create a space that was just his. And in addition, Nicky destroys property. Some of his behaviors include that. And we couldn't, we knew that we couldn't reasonably ask a shared living provider to allow Nicky to move into their home and then have him destroying their property. So that was that I list that as one of the core needs because that was something that we really needed to negotiate and talk about a lot with the provider agency that we had found, because that is another one of those out of the box kinds of things. And so we made it happen. So we had to have those in place. And then we had to, once those were identified, we began the master plan. So this is where Nicky's dad, my husband, Alex, his capacities as an engineer and project manager came in really handy because behold, let me show you the plan. There was a lot to do. I pulled out this diagram from a timeline for that I made in a different workshop years ago when I actually built a workshop around the Nicky story in Massachusetts years ago. And so we did this timeline at the time. And I pulled it out to illustrate just how much work was needed to be done with and by and next to the systems and providers before we could even get Nicky into the door. So many teams dictated by the systems begin to unravel supports around this time. Many teams and systems, things start to fall apart around this time, just before a person moves into a new setting or right when they move into a new setting. And there's a lot of failures because rather than being thoughtful in advance, like we decided to do, they simply fill the bed and hope it's a good match. There is no way that the structure of Nicky's new life could have been built without the team coming to the table at least 8 months ahead of time, meeting monthly to begin, and then twice a month as we got to the last couple months before Nicky actually arrived. And then weekly, those last few weeks before Nicky's arrival. So we started, ended, and practiced throughout those months the idea that this is a roadmap to success, that this is possible, and that we can do it together. And so we spent a lot of time, long before Nicky moved in at that star at the end of October, We spent a lot of time planning. And just by the fact that by virtue of the fact that we were creating something fairly new, and that we were all involved, and that we really wanted this to happen, what was an unexpected, wonderful result was that relationships were forming. The planning meeting during those months had an unintended result. Team members, we all found friends among each other, among all of our collaborators. We shared thoughts, we shared emotions, we struggled together with the challenges, we checked in on each other, and boy, did we celebrate all the successes as we got closer to the day Nicky moved in. And at the same time, Nonotuck was working hard on finding a potential caregiver. And another thing that they were doing that is relatively out of the box is they were introducing us to potential caregivers during the interview process and having us come in and meet these people at the same time that they were meeting them, before they even really had vetted them, because they made it clear to us that we needed to be a part of this conversation and a part of finding the person right from the very beginning. And that was extraordinary. We were encouraged to listen to our gut. We had to balance our gut with our need to find someone ready for the challenge. Like I've talked about before, we needed someone strong and capable, along with kind, because as Nicky's family, we are the stewards of his humanity. We're the holders of his story alongside him. And the story of who he is could only come from us. But I'll tell you, in the midst of all of this relationship forming, I felt the entire time that I was being heard, and that while I was doing my best to steward Nicky's voice, they were doing their best to listen. And that came from building those relationships as we started to plan for Nicky's arrival. So we ended up settling on a provider, and he was willing to move into Nicky's house. And we began visiting with him quite often. We chose him about 3 months before Nicky moved into the house. And he actually moved into the house before Nicky did, so he could kind of get the feel of it and start living there and so on. And we ended up having this wonderful relationship, this wonderful bond. He would come over to our house, we would go to him. We just spent a lot of time together, and we formed this wonderful bond, and he became a dear friend. So a few more weeks go by, and October 20th of 2012, the king arrives. His Majesty Nicky arrived at his home in Oxford. Now, this is a little homage to Nicky's love of Disney, but I think the truth is that's the little Lion King. I think that does a disservice, because he was a grown man, and that's really not what it looked like when Nicky arrived. It kind of looked a little bit more like this, but that's my own joke. That wasn't very nice. A little bit true, but not very nice. You know what? The truth is, it didn't take long for everybody to be just astounded and astonished at Nicky, the man who arrived, and it didn't take long for all of them to start looking more like this. Hakuna Matata every single day. And if you need to know, I don't have enough time to go on and on and on, although I could, about all the ways that this came forward. I want you to think back just for a second about what I described in the beginning of this workshop. This young man who was aggressive and violent all the time, kept in a corner, locked up, held down, restrained all day, every day. That's who came to this home in Oxford. But 3 months after he arrived, there was a 71% decrease in aggressive behaviors and a 90% decrease in self-abusive behaviors over a 10-year baseline. So those of you who are data junkies, I'm kind of one of them. My husband's definitely one of them. This is profound. This in itself is profound, because these behavioral data are what was defining Nicky up until that point. And they were defining him in a negative way and creating a vision of a monster. But within 3 months, this is what the new data was looking like. It was incredible. Now we're here 10 years later. Nicky has about 2 to 4 maybe significant behavioral episodes per year. It is absolutely incredible, but I want to make it really clear. One more thing, but let me I'm going to mix up my own slides here for just a second. I'm going to go back to the other one. This is what I want to make really clear. This was not a miracle. This was not Nicky suddenly becoming a better person. This was not Nicky suddenly being different and some miracle taking place. This was the same guy. It's just that he was given the opportunity to be in a place, in a space, in a home where people respected him, where people showed him love, where they honored what he was trying to communicate, where they heard him when he spoke. That was what caused all of these reductions in behaviors. That was what caused Nicky to change. And again, he did bad wording. He didn't change. He was himself in a place of love and mutual respect and understanding, mutual dependence, and again, love, adoration, really. Everybody who knows Nicky absolutely loves him. So let me go back to illustrate further some of the things that have happened in the course of these last 10 years. There are 2 shared living caregivers in 10 years, none of that overturned. There have been 5 additional staff. Nicky gets 2 to 1 support out in the community, even up to today. So when in the afternoons, when he gets home from his program during the day, there are additional staff. So there have only been 5 staff in 10 years. They have all stayed. They have created strong, authentic bonds. There is an extended family. The caregiver his name is Ben. He lives there with Nicky. Ben's family lives nearby, and Nicky goes over and visits them all the time along with Ben. They have dinner together. They go to events and family reunions together. There are community relationships. That little house where Nicky lives is at the end of a cul-de-sac where everybody knows him and loves him. There is shared decision-making in the home. Nicky is allowed and encouraged to be part of the decision-making. Frequent family visits. My husband and I go over there all the time, every Saturday, every Sunday, and sometimes in between. We drop in, we stay for a little while until Nicky wants us to leave, and then he makes that very clear, and we leave. And there are shared experiences between the family and all of the caregivers. We just get together and we do things all the time. None of this would have happened in a group, ever in a group home. Certainly none of this would have happened if, again, the shared living provider had not brought forward the core tenets and values that are necessary for successful shared living. So I'm looking at my clock. I'm going to breeze through some of these elements of success very quickly to kind of summarize what needed to happen. The elements of success for Nicky's story were that families and citizens needed to be ready to embrace new relationships between their loved ones and others. This is also globally true. Families and citizens need to be willing to work with the processes, willing to use civility, practice mutual respect, and respect boundaries that won't interfere with relationships, and be committed to regular communication with providers and agencies. Also, under the elements of success, a provider agency must be willing to support a challenging individual, spend the time and the resources needed, work with the family, if a family owns the home, work with that, and be willing to collaborate with the family and day program providers at every step. Those are what was necessary with the Nicky story. Provider agency needs to be asking the family to participate in caregiver interviews and hiring, training the caregivers in safety escalating and emergency restraint techniques if necessary, We needed a provider agency who would seek and train backup caregivers in the event of a sudden need. That is another thing that Nonotuck put into their own plan, and providing strong, consistent supports to the caregivers on an ongoing basis. Not only were these things important to the success, but they were important to the building of trust relationships that needed to happen among all of us. We needed a provider agency, and anyone who wants to replicate this needs a provider agency whose core values and thus its practices are firmly grounded in the beliefs that every human being has the capacity to love, the desire to be loved, valued, and respected. And then, when working from this framework, success is expected, and creativity, compassion, and civility are part of everyone's daily practices. And finally, here's the element of success that made it true for us. We needed to have a young man who loves to be with people and he loves and who love him, who's a neat freak, who loves to try new food, who wants to play chase and wrestle, keeps track of the date and time, can't get enough roller coasters, can find any video on YouTube, worries when is hurt, loves a good singer, knows all the Disney movie lines ever written, gives the best hugs, and is the best friend you could have. These are the category, or are the elements of success for Nicky's story, and the elements of success for anyone. That's Nicky's family right there. That's Ben in the background. That's the guy who lives with him now, who is absolutely a part of our life, our story, and our family. Jean Vanier is one of my biggest mentors, as you all know him as the founder of the L'Arche movement. And he said that we all know well that we can do things for others and in the process crush them, making them feel that they are incapable of doing things by themselves. To love someone is to reveal to them their capacities for life, the light that is shining in them. Nicky's light shines so bright thanks to the love and support of everyone in his life who are helping him build an authentic, happy life. And we couldn't be more happy with that. So thank you. My name is Cheryl Ryan Chan. I am available at CherylRyanChan.com as a workshop presenter and as a trainer, as person-centered planning facilitator, and absolutely through CherylRyanChan@gmail.com as a friend. I hope that I have achieved the things that I was hoping to do to both inspire you and give you some seeds of thought. And so in closing, I think that I've made this story into an inspirational message, a template, and a timeline. And I think that it has changed lives. I know it has, because others have replicated the model here in Massachusetts. I have yet to see the model be based on the story of love everywhere where others try to replicate it. So we have a lot of work to do. Nicky's story reveals how misperceptions and the words of people can push the narrative of an incapable monster to the forefront of service provision for one person, and that effectively can eliminate possibility and extinguish their capacities. But so too can this story inspire you to be one person who can change your life by believing in possibility regardless of the situation. Shared living is at the core of Nicky's journey. He did not fit into the mold of what the systems defined as someone who has or could succeed in this beautiful living model, but he has. So don't ever underestimate your ability to influence change. 3 minutes left.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Well, that's an incredible story, and I am trying to pull myself together. I have many tears of joy, and when that happens, it's hard for me to speak, but I'm pulling it together, and others are also filled with tears of joy and emotion about how this is incredible. Great work, Mom, taking the risk for him to reap the reward. Incredibly moving. I'd like to share that Cheryl is my best friend from high school, and it's been an amazing journey. I love her.
Hey, Michelle.
Nicky's home and his space was the #1 priority. You answered this question, but you may have more to say. Someone asked before you introduce the information, how are the additional staff coordinated?
before I introduce.
So you mentioned that your son has the live-in support, but then he also has other staff that come and
Right.
support two-on-one. How are those staff coordinated?
So yeah, okay. So that's a really good question. I'll answer it the way I think it's being asked. The additional staff come in the afternoons, and then on the weekends. The supervisor, the oversight is all done at the case manager level at Nonotuck. Okay, but within the household, Ben is the shared living care provider, and he lives with Nicky. He is the one who is at the forefront of finding and hiring the additional staff. And I love that component. And I think that's important to remember, because there have been situations over 10 years where the providers have brought in staff and they have not built a wonderful bond and relationship with Ben. And therein lies some real problems. But when Ben has been the one that has really been supported as the decision maker around staff, he's been able to bring in people that he really bonds well with, and that only benefits Nicky.
Great response. More inspirational. This is so insightful. Thank you so much. Thank you. So illuminating. Yes, to that light you all bring. Wonderful presentation, and my second time. This is such an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing. My second time listening to you. Great story. Thank you for sharing. What sort of support does Ben get?
Good question. Ben gets a lot of support. He has a case manager, and that case manager has a supervisor. And they're visiting Nicky's house in person and checking in with Ben at least weekly. And there's a whole bunch of reporting that has to be done across the board that's in place, but they really go above and beyond. And I would also add, under the heading of what support does Ben get, he gets our support. He gets Nicky and Nicky's family support directly to them, because as I talked about earlier, we have through the shared living model, we have the freedom to build relationships among us. And so I'm one of Ben's biggest fans. He knows he can count on me, and I can count on him.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much again, Cheryl. I can tell we'll be in touch for future sharing. It is 11:01. Thank you all for joining us. We have a 15-minute break before the next session begins, so hopefully we'll see you in another one. But Cheryl, just so you know, you win the prize for best attended session.
Yay! It's always the title. It's always the title that gets people in. Oh, that's awesome.
And I think it has something to do with you and your story as well. Have a great afternoon, everyone. We'll see you next.
Thank you. You too. I'm going to stay on for a couple minutes and look through the chat, if that's okay. Is that okay? All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Nicky, you can save the chat to your computer. Did you know that?
I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that right now. Okay.
That way you can actually, take your time and look at the names and see who said what.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go do that now so that I don't have to take up any more time. But thank you all. For those of you who I know who are here cheering me on.
Cheryl, that was just fantastic, beyond comprehension, just incredible. So thank you so much. It was so illuminating, brilliant. Everything about it is your genius, the genius of the whole. This is what's possible. Thank you so, so much.
Oh my God, Beth. Coming from you. Now I'm going to start bursting out into tears. Wow. Yeah. Thank you for attending, Beth. Thank you. I mean, everybody plays such a valuable role in everything, but thank you, Beth. And I see my best friend from high school who's going to be crying and crying.
Crying. All right. Kleenex.
Love you all. Thank you again. Thank
all
you.
Right. Take care all.
All righty. Take care. See you next.
Bye-bye.